This is the Razer Huntsman V3 Pro 10 keyless, Razer's latest iteration of the Huntsman series, and one that boasts several unique features and some exclusive tech that Razer claims makes this board the fastest high-performance keyboard you'll find on the market. Now, admittedly, I don't talk about keyboards too often here on the channel, but this one caught my eye not only because of its color but its unique switches, as instead of using the traditional switch types often used in high-performance boards, Razer is using their own proprietary analog switches here, which on paper seem to be quite similar to magnetic ones, but offer several unique features and superior performance in combination with the board's other features. And as such, I took the first chance I got to talk about this board, as I had really high hopes for it, and while there are several very well implemented features here on the board, other aspects of it are sadly underwhelming for a board of this price. So in today's episode of the mel0n review, we're going to take a deep dive into the Huntsman V3 Pro 10 keyless, and talk in depth about its performance, features, pros and cons, and much more. But before we get started, a big thanks to Razer for sending the Huntsman V3 Pro over for review. They also sent over the entire Gigantus V2 Pro pad lineup, which I'm very excited to talk about once I've wrapped up my testing, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video. And a massive thank you to all of our channel members who directly support what I do here. If you enjoy the teardown videos and my in-depth reviews, consider becoming a channel member, as it not only directly supports what I do here, it also gives you early access to upcoming content, including videos like this one. And as always, this review will be completely unbiased, meaning you'll get my honest opinions of everything I review here on the channel, with no affiliate codes, brand bias, or paid promos. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n review. For testing parameters, I tested the Huntsman for around 4 weeks, daily driving the board for both work and gaming use. I also tested the board in its stock configuration with its stock keycaps, with no other modifications made to the board. And for firmware, I tested it on firmware version 1.02.0, the latest firmware available for the board at the time of this review. For pricing and versions, the Huntsman V3 Pro in the 10 keyless version is available in 4 colorways. Firstly, it's available in black, which retails for $299 Canadian dollars. It's also available in white, which retails for $319 Canadian dollars. It's also available in the esports green colorway, which retails for $329, and the newly released Nico edition, which also retails for $329. Now, the board is also available in a full-size configuration if you prefer that layout, but sadly there's not an updated mini version currently, which hopefully we'll see upgraded and released in the near future. And in today's video, I'll be talking about the 10 keyless esports green colorway of the Huntsman V3 Pro. For packaging, the board comes in typical Razer style packaging, with the front showing some information about the board, including its layout and its switch information, and an interesting claim about this being the world's first 8kHz analog keyboard, a claim which we'll talk more about in a moment. Flipping the box onto its side, there is a list of Razer's partnered teams, and on the opposite side we'll find some more specs of the board, like its dimensions, what's included in the box, system requirements, etc. And on the back of the box we'll find even more specific details about the board, including its features like snap tap, rapid trigger, the actuation range of the board's analog switches, and more. Flipping the box over and opening it, we're met with the board itself, which comes wrapped in a large plastic wrapper which can be removed quite easily. Under the board there is a quick start guide which shows you how to adjust some of the onboard features, and we'll talk more about this and the board's other features later in this video. Below that we'll find a user manual which, similar to the guide we just talked about, outlines all the features and shortcuts of the board here, and it also lists the required regulatory information and the terms and conditions for the board's 2-year warranty. And just like we've seen in the user manuals included with our other products, stuffed in the back of the manual there is a small sheet of Razer stickers included here. Next, pulling back this cardboard flap, we'll find the board's stock cable, which is also wrapped in plastic. This cable is the typical USB A to C type, which comes with protective caps on both ends and a cable wrapper. And this cable also shares the same paracord wrapping and thicker design as the cables included with their mice. And while this cable is a rather rigid type due to the shielding inside of it, since you're not moving the keyboard around like you would a mouse, this stock cable is perfect for a keyboard. And lastly, nestled in the bottom of the box, we'll find the board's magnetic wrist rest, which is also wrapped in plastic. This rest features a leatherette surface which is actually quite grippy, and the rest anchors itself to the board decently well, though you can cause the rest to slide a little bit if you move your wrist in some cases. Now, this never impacted the board's performance or usage, but hopefully on the next iteration of the Huntsman we see some stronger magnitude is used for the wrist rest here. However, unlike many other high performance boards, the Huntsman doesn't include any additional accessories such as a keycap puller or a dust cover, which are items I expect to be included with a premium keyboard, especially one at this price point. And as a final unboxing note here, out of the box, my Huntsman was running an outdated firmware, and for whatever reason, even though I connected it to Synapse multiple times, it never prompted me to update the board's firmware. So if you purchase a Huntsman, be sure to check the firmware level of the board, and if needed, you can manually update the firmware quite easily, and we'll talk more about that process later. As a preface to this segment, keep in mind that this board was sent to me directly by Razer, so take the build quality and QC of my unit with a grain of salt. Now for build quality, overall the board is solid, though it is quite light, weighing only 213.5 grams, which is much lighter than many other high-end performance boards. This lighter weight combined with its case material does give the Huntsman a less premium feel compared to other high-end keyboards, especially given its price point. But to be fair, I understand the benefits of the lighter design here as it makes transporting the board easier, but I would have loved to see the board have a premium heft to it that would match its price tag, and a perfect way of increasing the board's weight without impacting its portability would have been to implement magnetic modular weights in the board's base, which is something I hope we see added on future iterations of the Huntsman. But despite its lighter design and plastic case material, the board does have a brushed aluminum top plate which gives the board good rigidity, but again I would have loved to see the entire shell be aluminum given the keyboard's price. And as you can see here, instead of the board being the traditional design where switches are inlaid into the top case, here the switches are installed into this aluminum top plate, which makes removing debris or cleaning the board much easier than it is on traditional board types, which is a nice attention to detail. For QC, overall the board is good, and these Gen 2 optical switches are well implemented, both in terms of feel and performance, and to Razer's credit, all the keys are very well stabilized, even the larger keys on the board, and over my testing I didn't have any issues with any of the keys or switches on the Huntsman, aside from their odd work-in period, which we'll talk more about in a moment. But again, I do have to criticize the foot design here, as they're rather small for a board of this size, meaning the board can be moved rather easily on some desktop types. Now to counteract this, I used a keyboard mat for the majority of my testing, but this is another aspect of the Huntsman's design I hope we see improved on the next iteration, as larger base feet would anchor the board much better, and also the wrist rest for that matter, and that would be a nice improvement to see here. For onboard features, aside from the switch's performance, which we'll talk about in a moment, at the top right of the board you'll find a large dial and two buttons, all of which are multifunction, but default to a volume control knob, a multimedia play pause button, and a bindable macro button, and the functions of all these can be modified via the board's driver. Below these buttons, positioned just above the arrow keys, we have a small display which Razer calls the array indicator, which is used to display the board's profile, modes, caps, and scroll locks, and also shows the actuations of the keys when pressed, which is a great little feature, and this allows the indicator to be used to natively adjust the board's actuation point and rapid trigger. Circling back to the included guide we talked about a moment ago, to adjust the switch's actuation point here, you can press function and tab, and then you can either use the dial or the arrow keys to set your preferred actuation point in millimeters, and the adjustable actuation point will be shown on the indicator, and during this process you can press any key on the board to visually see the force required to reach the set actuation point, allowing you to further fine-tune it. And once you set your desired configuration, you can press function tab again or the escape key to exit this configuration mode. Now a similar process is used to natively adjust the board's rapid trigger setting, but this particular feature is a little easier to adjust via the driver, and we'll go over that process later in this video. And as I mentioned earlier, this display also indicates the mouse's profile, of which the board supports 5. The first profile slot, white, which can be enabled by pressing function plus insert, is a dynamic slot that corresponds to the last profile used on Synapse. The next profile, green, which can be enabled by pressing function plus home, is a non-customizable default profile that sets all the keys to actuate at 2mm with all the other settings disabled. Next we have the red profile, which can be enabled by pressing function plus page up, in which all the keys are set to actuate at 1.2mm, and rapid trigger is enabled on the WASD keys at the 0.3mm level. In the blue profile, which can be enabled by by pressing Function plus Delete. All the keys are set to the same 1.2mm actuation point as the previous profile, but rapid trigger isn't enabled here, but analog input is activated for the WASD keys, allowing them to function like a controller's left stick, which allows for 360 degrees of movement, not the traditional 8-way movement commonly found on keyboards, which is a really unique feature. However, it's not supported in all game types, so keep that in mind. In the yellow profile, which can be enabled by pressing Function plus End, all the keys are again set to actuate at 1.2mm, but the WASD keys are set to a racing profile, which utilizes the aforementioned analog input to function like a control stick and triggers. And in the cyan profile, which is enabled by pressing Function plus Page Down, all the keys are set to actuate at 0.8mm, and rapid trigger is enabled again and set to 0.3mm, and this is the profile used for the majority of my testing as it was the most responsive. Aside from profiles, the board also supports Snap Tap, which can be enabled by pressing Function plus Shift. When enabled, this function prevents selected keys from registering simultaneously, overriding a held down key's input with one of a latter one, and by default this feature is tied to A and D keys as it can be used to instantaneously counter-strafe in some games. However, since this feature technically gives you an unfair advantage in Counter-Strike specifically, this feature is banned in that game and will get you banned if you use it, so if you play Counter-Strike be sure to disable this feature, but in other games, at least as of now, this feature is allowed. And lastly, you can natively adjust the board's lighting as well, but we'll talk about how to do this natively and via the board's driver later in this video. For stock switches, and as I mentioned earlier, unlike essentially every other high-performance board on the market, most of which use magnetic switches, Razer has opted not to adopt magnetic switches on the Huntsman and their other keyboards for that matter, as this board uses optical switches, specifically Razer's proprietary analog Gen 2 optical switches. These switches are quite unique as not only do they have a unique structure, which is similar-ish to that of a mechanical switch, they have this large stabilizing bracket that connects the switch's upper and lower housings together. This is what gives the switches their stellar stabilization that I talked about earlier, being the best I've ever seen on a keyboard switch to date, but unlike most switch types, these switches are soldered to the board's PCB, meaning they're not swappable or serviceable, which is a little disappointing compared to other, more serviceable switch types, but given their proprietary nature, this was to be expected. For the switch's feel, despite their mechanical looking appearance, these switches are fully linear, having no tactile response point in their 0.1 to 4mm travel range. Now, Razer is advertising that these switches have an actuation weight of around 40 gram force, which is similar to many magnetic switch types, but out of the box, these switches feel a little heavier, more akin to a 50 gram force weight at least on my unit, but they do lighten up as the switches are worked in, so to speak. Now, this really threw me for a loop initially as I couldn't figure out why some switches were heavier than advertised, but it turns out they uniquely just have a work-in period of sorts, which admittedly is a very odd thing as I've never experienced a work-in period on any kind of mechanical or magnetic switch to date. Obviously this could have just been an isolated issue with my unit, but it's still something I wanted to mention as I have seen a couple other posts online about the Huntsman switches being a little heavy out of the box. These switches also feature factory calibrated dead zones to ensure consistent performance on the switches, but uniquely these dead zones are adjustable via the driver, and they also support rapid trigger which can be used to improve the responsiveness of the switches, and you can configure separate up and down stroke values via the driver, and they also support dual step actuation where you can configure the switch to input two separate functions when pressed firmly or lightly, and while these features aren't new by any means, seeing them on an analog switch is actually very cool to see. Now on paper, these switches and magnetic switch types have very similar features and specs, and admittedly I was a little confused as to why Razer didn't just use magnetic switches here like the majority of the other high performance boards do, and as it turns out, this decision was made due to magnetic switches' performance variations and interference potential, as magnetic switches always have some variance in their actuation weight, albeit it's always within a couple grams, but there is variance nonetheless, and due to their magnetic nature they are also susceptible to metallic and magnetic interference, and they also cite that the magnetic flux of said switch types can weaken over the lifespan of the switch, and all these are valid criticisms but only to an extent, whereas these Gen 2 switches are conveniently not only calibrated to have have an exact 40 gram force actuation weight, they're also immune to all aforementioned interference issues. And because of this, Razer is claiming that these Gen 2 switches are superior to magnetic switch types, and while they're technically not wrong here, the flaws of the magnetic switches they're pointing out are very niche flaws, as I've been using magnetic boards for almost 2 years now and I've never run into any of these aforementioned issues. To be fair, I don't have a metallic desk, which you can't use magnetic keyboards on, but nonetheless my experience has been pretty consistent with this switch type, and I've never experienced a significant variance in a magnetic switch's actuation force for that matter as well. Now, in my opinion, the true failure point of any keyboard switch is their springs, and since these Gen 2 switches still use springs, as all other switch types do, there is still a failure point here, and as such, Razer is advertising that these switches have a cycle rating of 100 million cycles, which is similar to the cycle ratings of other magnetic switch types, which usually have cycle ratings ranging between 100 and 150 million. So while on paper, technically speaking, these optical switches are superior over other switch types, keep in mind that they are not hot swap nor are they serviceable, unlike magnetic and mechanical switch types, meaning that if a switch's spring or lubing fails here on the Huntsman, you'll have to RMA the entire board via the warranty and not just swap in a new switch like you can on other board types. And to speak on performance, Razer is advertising that these Gen 2 switches are apparently 2.5 times better than other switches, but the comparison data on their website for the switches are very vague, and in my experience when it comes to keyboards, ergonomics and usage experience are king, and while the board has great ergonomics and some very unique features due to the switch's analog nature, they do have a rather clacky feel to them, feeling more akin to that of a linear mechanical switch just without an actuation point. And this is where these switches fall short in my opinion, as while they have great performance, they don't exactly feel premium due to the cheaper feel of the case and the board's interesting acoustics, which makes their usage experience not exactly up to par for a board of this price point, as there are countless other boards on the market that feel better to use than the Huntsman here, even though they technically have worse performance. But a great example of this is my 2-year-old Keep HM80 with its stock Gateron Jade Pro switches, which despite all the downsides Razer is saying magnetic switches have, the HM80 has been one of the most consistent boards I've ever used, and has a much better usage experience compared to the Huntsman, even though it's 2 years old at this point. Now, to be fair to Razer, my perspective on this board are unique as I've already been using magnetic boards for a few years now, so for me, the overall experience here on the Huntsman is a downgrade. However, if you're upgrading from a mechanical board, it will obviously be an upgrade in almost every way. And circling back to the claim on the front of the box, claiming that this is the world's first analog optical 8 GHz keyboard, technically speaking, this is correct, as to my knowledge, no other brand has used analog optical switches on their keyboards, as all high-end performance boards tend to use magnetic or inductive switch types. However, this is not the only analog input capable board on the market, but those boards use the aforementioned alternative switch types instead of the optical switches that are found here. But to Razer's credit, the board's high polling rates are very well implemented, but seeing as every other high performance board also utilizes 8K polling, this isn't exactly a standout aspect of the board, and while it does have great latency, being advertised as being 11% faster than a competition's board, which conveniently isn't named, having a latency of around 0.58 milliseconds compared to 0.68 milliseconds, according to their data of course. But keep in mind again, every single high performance board has some form of sub 1 millisecond latency, and at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, ergonomics and usage experience are king, and while the Huntsman's ergonomics are great, the switches and the overall experience of the board just doesn't feel that great compared to other boards. Now, to be fair, this isn't entirely the switch's fault, as if they were used on a different board with better acoustics and a better design, I think they'd actually work really well, but the board they're currently installed in just doesn't complement their nature very well, leading to the board's overall usage experience being subpar for its price point. For keycaps, the Huntsman uses the traditional double-shot PBT keycap types used by many keyboards, but one nice detail to the caps here is that their lettering is translucent, not printed, allowing the board's lighting to shine through them, and this makes them immune to wear and tear. For profile, the keys appear to use a cherry-like profile, but some of the keys are angled ever so slightly differently, giving the board what appears to be a hybrid OEM cherry-like profile. And one nice attention to detail here is that the keycaps use a standard MX style stem, not a proprietary or aftermarket one, meaning the keyboard is fully compatible with all keycaps that use MX style stems. But the defining feature of these keycaps here is their surfacing, as instead of having the traditional smoother surfacing, the ones here on the Huntsman are very granular, the most textured I've ever seen on a keycap to date. This makes the keys incredibly grippy, preventing any slipping or actuation issues when using the board, even in more intensive situations and even with my sweatier hands. But while the feel of these keycaps is surprisingly good, their walling is quite thin, which gives the keys a hollower sound than thicker keycap types, which unfortunately further cheapens the board's acoustics. But to be fair, this is a very minimal nitpick, and if you want thicker keycap types, you can replace them easily due to the stem style here. However, one feature I'm very disappointed not to see on the Huntsman is a split spacebar, as this is a feature I adore on my Psychic Keep HM80, and something I found myself missing here on the Huntsman quite a bit, and seeing as other brands, most notably Wooting, are adopting this type of split spacebar, hopefully on the next iteration of the Huntsman we see Razer adapt this spacebar style. Moving on to ergonomics, this is one aspect where the Huntsman shines in my opinion, as the board's natural ergonomics are great, and the included wrist rest makes this aspect of the board even better. Now in its stock orientation, the board's profile is very sleek, having a natural tilt of around 4 degrees, which is much thinner and much less aggressively tilted than many other high performance boards I've used, but if you need to, you can adjust the board's tilt to 6 or 9 degrees via the base feed to further improve its ergonomics. And notably, due to the slimmer forward height here, I didn't run into any misactuation issues with the bottom row of the keyboard, even on lower actuation points, something I commonly have issues with on other board types. But if you have smaller hand types and do have issues with this, you can use the included wrist rest to nullify this issue entirely, which is a great attention to detail here that's often missed on many other high performance keyboards. And over my testing period, when using the board with or without the wrist rest, I was able to use the Huntsman for long gaming or writing or editing sessions without any strain, tensioning, or other ergonomic related issues, and it's worth noting that the smaller keycaps do have concave indentations in their surface that naturally guide your fingers to rest at their middle point, similar to what the function of grooving and main clicks do on many mice, and combined with their fantastic grippy surfacing, all the keys as mentioned earlier are very grippable and further improve the board's ergonomics by preventing finger strain. For acoustics, as I mentioned earlier, Razer has somewhat improved the Huntsman V3 Pro's acoustics compared to its previous iterations, as they've added dampening foam inside the case to help dampen the switch's sound, but as I've alluded to many times already, despite this change, the board's acoustics are still less than ideal for a board of this price. The reason for these subpar acoustics is the case's material, as while the aluminum plate is a nice feature for durability and rigidity, because the switches are anchored into it, when the keys are actuated they make that mechanical clacky-like sound, which in combination with the metal and the plastic base and thin-walled keycaps gave the board a very plasticky mechanical acoustic profile, which is something I did not expect on a board of this price point and something I would expect from a budget mechanical board. And to better explain the board's subpar acoustics, here's how the Huntsman V3 Pro sounds compared to other magnetic and mechanical keyboards. To be perfectly honest, considering the Huntsman's pricing, I expected a much better acoustic profile here, and again, while they've done some things to improve it coming from the previous iterations, which I do give them credit for, there's a lot more that needs to be done for this aspect of the Huntsman, and hopefully on future iterations of this board, Razer can improve the case's dampening foam and overall acoustics, as a board this expensive should not sound like a budget mechanical board in any universe, regardless of how well it performs. For lighting, and as expected for a Razer product, the Huntsman sports a variety of lighting-related features, as the switches have north-facing lighting which are all customizable. Now as I mentioned earlier, the lettering on the keycaps is semi-transparent, allowing the switch's lighting to shine through the keycaps, but overall the lighting here on the board is pretty muted, but you can easily improve it by swapping the stock keycaps for transparent ones, which better accent the board's lighting than the stock ones do in my opinion. The board's lighting can be adjusted via Synapse or natively by pressing Ctrl Control plus Function plus 0 to 9, and you can adjust the color of said profile by reactuating the keybind here. And you can also natively adjust the brightness of the board by pressing Function plus F11 or F12 to dim or brighten it respectively, or you can control this via the driver. Now, personally speaking, I'm not the biggest fan of lighting on keyboards, so I disabled the lighting for the majority of my testing, but if you like lighting, there's plenty of it to play around with here. But if you want to do more advanced lighting customization such as per key lighting, you will have to use the Razer Chroma app, whereas on other brands' boards you can fully customize the board's lighting natively or via the respective driver, and having to rely on a secondary program to adjust more advanced lighting configurations is disappointing here. But seeing as this is the case for all of Razer's other products, I'm not exactly surprised at this aspect here. For software experience, the Huntsman was the first Razer device to support customization via both Synapse 4 and Synapse Web, but just like we saw with the Viper V4 Pro, many of the device's features aren't customizable via the web driver, and because of this, I'll be talking about the software experience when using Synapse 4 here. I also wanted to know, out of the box, I had several instances where the board would wipe or override changes I made to the board's profiles, which was rather frustrating, but as I mentioned earlier, since my board was running an outdated firmware out of the box, once I updated the firmware to the latest version, this issue went away. So again, if you get a Huntsman or any of Razer's other boards, be sure to check the firmware level, and I'll have Razer's firmware update page and the WebDriver link and Synapse 4's download page all linked down in the video description if you happen to need it. Now, launching Synapse, once you connect the board to your PC, the Huntsman will pop up and you can double click on it to configure its settings. Now, in the first tab called Customized, here we can enable or disable the board's gaming mode, adjust its settings, configure the board's polling rate, which by default will be set to 8000 Hz. Below that, we have options to adjust the dead zones of the stock switches, and next we have shortcuts to the Windows keyboard and gamepad settings. Below that, we'll find all the gamepad related features here. Firstly, you can enable or disable the keyboard input pass-through and its gamepad override, which can also bind the keyboard's keys to a joystick input as well as trigger inputs, as the stock switch's analog input allows you to simulate this, but this feature only works in some games, so keep that in mind. Circling back to the top of the customized page, below the readout of the keyboard we have a small gamepad button, which you can use to bind the various keys of the gamepad to the board's buttons, allowing you to use the entire keyboard as a controller. Next to that button, we have a toggle for the sidebar here, which lists all the keyboard's keys, and you can click these buttons or the keys in the readout of the keyboard to rebind them at will. And lastly, there's a toggle for hypershift, which you can bind to a key to allow further customization and rebind options to the keyboard's keys. But one feature that's notably missing here is an alternative layout toggles, which are found on other boards and allow you to quickly reconfigure the keys for Dvorak or other layouts, and admittedly, while this is a bit of a niche feature, it'd be nice to see support for this added in the future. Moving on to the next tab called Actuation, here we can adjust the function of the switches. Firstly, we can enable or disable snap tap and adjust what keys it's binded to. Below this, we can adjust the actuation point of the switches from 0.1 to 4 millimeters, and there are buttons that allow you to sync this actuation point to specifically selected keys or the entire keyboard. Next, we have the board's rapid trigger settings, which can be configured between the switch's 0.1 and 1 millimeter range, and you can separate up and downstroke values if needed, and again there are buttons to sync this to the entire keyboard or just selected keys. There is also an option to enable continuous rapid trigger if you need that feature. But it's important to note, if you enable the analog gamepad input mode here, it will disable the adjustments made to the switch's actuation and rapid triggers, so keep that in mind. And it's also worth noting on the board, the caps lock, Windows, function, insert, delete, page up, page down, and N keys don't support tunable actuations or rapid trigger due to their functionality. And lastly, in the lighting tab, we can adjust the board's lighting. Firstly, we can enable or disable it, adjust its brightness, and below that you can configure when the lighting will auto turn off and set an idle timer if needed. And in the last section here, you can configure several quick effects for the keyboard's lighting, which are also selectable by pressing function plus control 0 to 1. But as mentioned earlier, if you want more advanced control over the board's lighting or to create custom profiles, you'll need to install and use Razer's Chroma app, a whole separate program, which is a little disappointing considering other keyboards allow for full lighting customization in their software, but this is typical for Razer's products, so this isn't exactly a surprise. And circling back to the main page, at the top left we can select the keyboard's profile, and you can alter or reset these profiles by pressing the three dots here if needed. You can also adjust the board's onboard profiles by pressing the memory card button next to it, and here you can also swap our profile slot is set to a specific profile. And lastly, at the upper right side here, you can click this book icon to show a quick start guide for the board, and next to that button button, you can press this question mark one, which will lead you to a separate page that links to support information, as well as its serial number, device firmware version, and a link to the product registration tab, as well as the board's factory reset button. And as I mentioned a moment ago, while the board does support Synapse Web, some of the settings in Synapse 4 versions aren't adjustable there, so while it's nice to have a WebDriver to make some quick changes to the board, such as adjusting profiles or the switch's settings, if you need to do any kind of deeper customization, you'll have to use Synapse 4. In closing, overall the Huntsman V3 Pro 10 keyless is unfortunately a mixed bag from my experience here, as while the board does have many pros such as its onboard controls, surprisingly solid performance with these optical analog switches, though they do have that odd working period at least on my unit, and they can be used as analog input to simulate joystick input, which is a really cool feature in games that support it. It has the best keycaps I've ever seen on a board to date and great stock ergonomics, and the included wrist rest further improves the board's ergonomics and is a great attention to detail. But sadly, the board also has a lot of cons, as it doesn't include any extra accessories aside from the wrist rest such as a dust cover or a keycap puller. It's also very light and its case material makes it feel rather cheap. The foot design isn't the best and I would love to see larger ones that better anchor the board on future iterations. The optical switches, while unique, aren't hot swap or serviceable, making repairing the board impossible. The board stock acoustics are very underwhelming considering its price, and while it supports a WebDriver, some of the features aren't customizable via it, meaning you'll still need to use Synapse 4 to adjust some of the board's more advanced settings. And the board's price is frankly outrageous considering its acoustic profile and overall quality, which makes it very difficult to recommend even though it has a lot of positives, as other high performance boards feel and sound better in my opinion, even if they do have worse performance quote unquote. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks again to Razer for sending the Huntsman V3 Pro 10 keyless over for review. And as I mentioned at the top of this video, they were also kind enough to send over the entire Gigantus V2 Pro lineup, which I'm very excited to talk about once I'm done my testing, so get subscribed so you don't miss those reviews. And if you enjoyed this review and want to support my efforts with these in-depth reviews and of course the Teardown project, consider becoming a member here on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support the channel aside from leaving a like and getting subscribed, and being a channel member also gives you early access to all upcoming content here on the channel, so if you want to support what I do here, become a channel member today. But thanks again for watching my review of the Huntsman V3 Pro 10 keyless, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.